The auditorium at East Ridge College buzzed with excitement. Graduation morning, cameras flashing, families cheering. Then security approached an older man near the front. "Sir, I'm really sorry. We had a security issue last year. Unauthorized guests, even threats. The school tightened rules. No badge, no entry, even for family." He held up the folded card. The officer looked at it, read it, then sighed. "That's from your son, I see that. But I can't break protocol. I wish I could." They called for backup. Then one man in the fifth row stood, then another, then four more. No words, no explanations. But in seconds, the entire room fell silent. It was the kind of morning that only happens in late spring when the air still carries a chill, but the sun dares to shine like it means it. At Berkeley Hill College, a small liberal arts campus tucked into the hills of Vermont, the courtyard was already alive. Families gathered with flowers and signs. Students in navy caps fixed their gowns, their laughter echoing through the stone arches. Camera shutters clicked like distant applause. Inside the main auditorium, rows of chairs gleamed under soft white lights. At the front, brass plates on velvet ropes, reserved for family. At the back, open seating already filling fast. But Frank Delaney didn't come through the main entrance. He didn't arrive in a minivan packed with balloons or dressed in a new suit. He came alone, quiet, unhurried. Through the side access door near the faculty wing, he stepped inside wearing a faded M65 military field jacket. One sleeve slightly frayed. His boots were clean, but the leather had long lost its shine. He moved like a man used to waiting, not out of habit, out of training. In his hand, folded neatly, was a small card creases worn from being opened and closed too many times. On it, written in slanted blue ink, "Dad, front row's yours today. Love, Luke." Frank glanced toward the reserved section. Families were already seated, hugging, chatting, adjusting corsages. Ushers in navy blazers guided people to their rows. He stepped forward, one hand holding the card, the other at his side. Before he could cross the velvet rope, a young woman barely in her 20s with a headset and clipboard blocked his path. "Sir, this section is for family members only. Do you have a pass?" Frank showed her the card. She glanced at it confused for a second. Then her tone hardened, not unkind, just procedural. "I'm sorry. Without a credential badge, I can't let you through. You'll need to find a seat toward the back." Frank didn't argue. Didn't even ask her to check the list. He gave a small nod, turned and walked away. Back past the rows of chairs, past the usher, past the warm buzz of celebration, until he reached the wall beneath the red exit sign where he stopped, still holding the card. He stood there like a statue the room hadn't asked for, not in anyone's way, not demanding anything, just watching, waiting. And if anyone had looked closely, really looked, they might have noticed something in his face, a stillness too practiced to be accidental. Eyes scanning the room not with judgment, but with quiet presence, like a man who had once been trained to watch for danger, and never quite unlearned the habit. But no one really noticed. They were too busy getting their phones ready, too busy waving at their graduate from the third row, too busy preparing for a milestone, except for one person, a woman near the front who happened to glance his way and felt without knowing why that something about this man didn't quite belong, and yet somehow belonged more than anyone else in the room. Annabelle Mayfield sat near the front third row from the stage aisle seat, just where she liked it. She was a high school literature teacher from 2 towns over, polished, prepared, and early just like always. Her only child, Aaron, was graduating with honors today. Annabelle had circled this date on her calendar a year ago, then underlined it twice. She wasn't the kind to miss details, so when a man walked in through the side entrance wearing an old military jacket and took position under the glowing red exit sign, she noticed. At first, she didn't think much of it. Guests trickled in from all directions on graduation day. But the longer she looked, the more she sensed something off. He didn't have a program in hand. Didn't scan the crowd like others did, searching for a familiar face. He just stood there, card-in-hand posture, straight eyes, fixed on the stage like something important was about to happen, and he didn't want to miss it. There was a stillness to him, not the stillness of uncertainty, but of habit, like someone who had learned to wait without fidgeting. Annabelle's gaze drifted. A few seats behind her in the fifth row sat a group of men, 6 of them, scattered across a cluster of seats, no matching clothes but the same posture. Shoulders square, backs straight, eyes sharp. They weren't talking. They weren't scrolling their phones. They were watching him, the man by the wall. They weren't obvious about it, but they weren't hiding it either. Each wore something simple, button-down shirts, rolled sleeves, khakis, or dark jeans. Civilian. Quiet. But there was something unified in the way they sat, like they'd been trained not to draw attention, unless they needed to. Annabelle's instincts stirred. Over nearly 2 decades in the classroom, she had learned to spot discomfort, to read the silence between the lines. The boy who stared at the floor during roll call, the girl who always raised her hand but never smiled. Something about this moment felt the same. She looked back at the man by the wall. He hadn't moved, still holding the card. The ceremony started. Music floated in from the string quartet near the side doors. Applause rose as the faculty processed in robes flowing like banners. The dean made a joke about finals week. Parents laughed, phones rose, cameras flashed. But Frank Delaney didn't laugh, and neither did the 6 men in row 5. Annabelle sat still, her fingers curled lightly around her program. Her eyes flicked between the man near the exit sign and the men behind her, and then back again. She didn't know what she was witnessing, but she knew it was building. Like the pause before thunder. Like the breath before a truth someone doesn't want to say out loud. The girl with the clipboard passed by the man again, this time with someone in a darker suit. They were talking low, urgent. Frank remained still. Annabelle leaned slightly forward, heart pacing for a reason she couldn't name. She had come to watch her daughter graduate. Instead, she found herself unable to look away from a man who stood alone, and 6 others who hadn't stopped watching him since the moment he walked in. It started quietly, just a shift in energy. Annabelle Mayfield noticed the first motion from the corner of her eye. The usher with the clipboard had returned, but this time she wasn't alone. A man in a dark suit walked beside her, earpiece in one ear, a subtle bulge on his hip. Security. They both approached the man by the wall. Frank Delaney turned toward them calmly, as if he'd been expecting it, as if this moment had been circling for a while now. The security officer spoke low, but Annabelle was close enough to catch the tone, firm, impersonal. "Sir, you're going to have to leave this section. Credentials are required. It's school policy." Frank didn't argue. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the folded card, and held it out, not like proof, but like a quiet offering. The officer didn't even touch it. "I'm sorry. That's not official. Without credentials, we can't make exceptions." Annabelle's throat tightened. She glanced down at her program, fingers trembling. Then just for a second, she stood. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her eyes met Frank's across the aisle. He gave her the smallest nod. Not of thanks, of understanding. And somehow, that made it worse. She sat back down, ashamed not of him, but of herself. He didn't plead, didn't ask for help. He simply turned slightly as if preparing to step toward the exit. Behind him on stage, a name echoed through the speakers. Luke Delaney. Frank paused, just for a second. His eyes lifted not to the guard, but to the stage. He knew that voice, that name, and though no one noticed it yet, something had shifted. From the fifth row, a single chair creaked. A man stood. He was tall, early 40s, maybe sleeves rolled, face unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't raise a hand. He just stood. Then 3 seats over another man stood. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth, and finally a sixth. All from the same row. All eyes now on them. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. The sound of them rising chair legs scuffing lightly against polished floor was louder than any voice in that room. Even the security guard paused his stance, shifting slightly as he noticed. The first man took a slow step forward. Then another. He walked past the front rows, past the faculty seating, and toward Frank. The others followed, not in formation, not in step, but together with a kind of unshakable intention. Annabelle stared. Everyone did now. No one clapped, no one whispered. They just watched. The lead man stopped beside Frank, looked at the guard. No raised voice, no demand. Just one sentence delivered steady as stone. He stays. The guard blinked. Something in his posture faltered just for a moment. Annabelle could feel her heart pounding. Frank said nothing. His eyes met the man beside him, just for a moment. Recognition, but no explanation. The 6 men turned slightly, forming a quiet half-circle around him, not boxing him in, but backing him up. And in that moment, something in the air shifted. Like the room had been holding its breath without knowing it. Annabelle finally exhaled. Her fingers loosened on her program. She looked around. Faces frozen. Phones lowered. Even the dean on stage had paused mid-sentence, mouth half open. One usher stepped back. The clipboard slipped slightly in her hands. She looked at the guard who didn't move, didn't speak, just stood still, caught between protocol and something far bigger than it. Frank Delaney didn't smile, didn't nod. He just stood like he always had, like a man used to silence being the only answer he ever needed. But now, he wasn't standing alone. The 6 men stood still, shoulder to shoulder, close but not crowded. No one gave instructions. No one had to. They didn't put a hand on Frank Delaney's shoulder. They didn't form a wall. What they created was something quieter and stronger. A presence, a statement without a single word. It wasn't security. It wasn't defiance. It was loyalty, the kind that doesn't need uniforms or introductions. Frank remained in place. His hands still held the card, fingers curled gently around its edges. He didn't glance around, didn't check for reactions. His eyes stayed forward, calm, steady, like this wasn't the first time he'd been surrounded by men like these, and probably not the first time they'd done it for him. The security officer took a half step back, not in fear, but in hesitation, as if something unspoken had crossed the line between duty and dignity. One of the 6 tall, square-jawed eyes that had seen things most, never will, spoke again. Just 2 words. He's staying. That was it. Not shouted, not challenged, just delivered like a fact. And somehow it was more final than any official policy ever printed. Annabelle felt her hands trembling. But she wasn't scared. She was witnessing something rare, something almost sacred. She turned her head slightly, just enough to glimpse the others around her. People had stopped shifting in their seats. Programs were lowered. Hands stilled. No one reached for their phones. And still, no one clapped. Because this wasn't that kind of moment. It wasn't a performance. It was the undoing of a mistake in real time. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood it. This man Frank was not meant to stand at the edge of this room. Not today. Not any day. He belonged right here. And if no one had seen it before, they saw it now. The 6 men didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. Their presence said enough. There was something in their silence that carried the weight of memory and history. Like they had once followed Frank through something the rest of the room would never understand, and today they were simply following him again. Annabelle swallowed hard. She didn't know who they were, didn't know their names, their ranks, their pasts. But she knew this. They weren't ordinary. And neither was the man they stood behind. For a long moment, no one moved. The 6 men stayed beside Frank Delaney, unmoving. The security officer lingered a few feet away, uncertain. And the room, this bright, joyful auditorium moments ago, had become still as stone. Then came the shuffle of a chair from the side section. A man stood. He was older, mid-70s perhaps, with a chest full of ribbons beneath a slate-gray jacket. His frame wasn't what it once was, but he carried himself with the kind of posture you don't unlearn. Deliberate steps brought him to the edge of the seating. He cleared his throat, not for attention, but to settle his voice. Frank Delaney saved my life. The sentence dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Helmand Province, 2007. Our convoy hit an IED, burning wreckage, live rounds still cooking off. He pulled me out, and 4 others. His eyes swept the room not to demand belief, but to share weight. He didn't wait for backup. He didn't check orders. He just went. A long pause. He never asked for recognition. He nodded once, then slowly sat back down. And just like that, the room changed again. Not louder, deeper, like something invisible had been set right. Frank Delaney didn't move. He didn't even blink. But in that instant, he wasn't a man standing quietly in the margins. He was a man everyone had failed to see until someone finally said his name. Annabelle's breath caught. She looked down at the card still in Frank's hand, trembling slightly now under the weight of so much silence. Then, from the stage, a sound. Shoes stepping off hardwood. A figure moving from behind the podium. Luke Delaney. Cap-tilted robe, swaying eyes locked ahead. He moved quickly, more urgency than ceremony, down the steps past his fellow graduates, past the stunned faculty down the center aisle. He didn't ask for the microphone. He didn't look at the crowd. He stopped halfway and turned. "That's my father." 4 words. The room stopped breathing again. He never wanted a spotlight. Every morning before school, for as long as I can remember, he told me the same thing. Luke's voice caught. He blinked hard, then continued. "Stand tall. Do what's right. Be the kind of man you'd salute first, even if no one's watching." He looked toward his father, still by the wall, still surrounded by the 6 men who had stood without being asked. He told me never to chase applause. That honor should be earned in silence, not bought with attention. A pause. Luke's next words came slower. He wasn't speaking to the crowd anymore. "But today, I need the world to know what it cost him to be here." Then Luke moved again, past the velvet ropes, past the guards, past the stairs. He walked straight to Frank, stopped, stood tall, and with practiced precision brought his hand to his forehead in a full formal military salute. Not as a soldier, but as a son. Frank didn't return it. Not yet. Instead, he stepped forward and pulled his son into a quiet, steady embrace. There was no applause, no gasp, just silence. But this time, it wasn't shame. It was reverence. The kind that doesn't need to be explained. Because in that moment, no one was asking who Frank Delaney was anymore. They knew. Frank Delaney didn't speak. He didn't smile. His arms simply closed around his son, firm, steady, like he'd done 1,000 times in the dark when no one was watching. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even long. Just long enough for the boy in his arms to know, "You did good. I'm here." Luke held on tightly, then stepped back. Frank looked at him, nodded once. The kind of nod that only means something when it's earned. The 6 men behind them hadn't moved. They didn't need to. Still standing at quiet attention, eyes forward, no gestures, no words. Their presence alone told the room this wasn't over yet. And then someone clapped. Just one person. Soft. Barely audible. Then another. Then 2 more. Until it wasn't just hands, it was a wave. A slow building tide of sound echoing off the walls, folding through the aisles. Not a celebration. A reckoning. Applause without fanfare. Without cheers. Without anyone needing to be told to rise. Row by row the auditorium stood. No speaker called for it. No cue was given. They just knew. Because sometimes the weight of a single person's silence carries more than a room full of speeches. Annabelle Mayfield was already on her feet. Her program had slipped from her lap, forgotten. Her hands came together gently, rhythmically, eyes wet with something she didn't bother hiding. She watched as Frank Delaney at last took a breath. Not deep, not dramatic, but final. Then he moved. No announcement. No permission. He stepped forward. The men behind him followed. They didn't guide him. They walked a respectful step behind where they'd clearly always belonged. Frank didn't rush. Each step was measured. Not heavy. Not slow. Just steady. Like a man walking toward something he didn't need but had finally been given. Space opened for him. A path that hadn't existed moments ago was now clear. Nobody stepped aside out of fear. They did it because they understood he'd already earned that walk long before today. Frank reached the reserved section. The velvet rope had been quietly unhooked. No one said a word. He paused, not to savor it, but to make sure it was real. Then Annabelle, still standing, stepped forward. She reached out gently, lifting the velvet rope for him. Their eyes met. No words, just a shared breath of understanding. Then she nodded toward the seat beside her, an open space, waiting. Not as a favor, but as a welcome long overdue. Frank nodded once, then took the seat. Second row, center left. Right where Luke had written he belonged. Luke sat beside him. No need to talk. The 6 men remained behind them, not returning to their seats. Not yet. They stood like sentinels, not demanding attention, but commanding respect by presence alone. Frank didn't look around. He just sat still, card tucked gently into his coat pocket. His hands rested calmly in his lap. The ceremony resumed eventually. But the room had changed. The applause that followed the next name read from the program was softer, more intentional. Because now everyone had remembered what they were really here for. Not just diplomas, not just speeches, but people, stories, fathers who stood in the shadows until someone finally said, "He's staying." After the last name was called and the caps had been tossed, the room began to empty. Slowly. Like people knew they had just seen something more than a graduation. Frank Delaney didn't rush to leave. He remained seated for a few minutes longer, his hands folded loosely, the card still resting inside his jacket, closer now than ever. One by one, students passed by. Some paused, some said nothing. Some simply reached out a handshake, a nod, a quiet "Thank you." None of them asked who he was. None of them needed to. One young woman, still wearing her cap, tears streaking her mascara, paused in front of him. She didn't speak. She just stood at attention, offered him a quiet, practiced salute. Then walked away. And Frank, as always, stayed silent. Then one of the 6 men stepped forward. He didn't say anything either. He simply reached into his pocket and placed something small in Frank's palm. A coin, not currency. A challenge coin, weathered familiar. On one side, the insignia of their old unit. On the other, 5 words etched in brass. "We stand because you once did." The man leaned in slightly, just enough for only Frank to hear. "We were your men in Helmand, sir. You led us out. We never forgot." Then he stepped back. No salute, no goodbye, just a quiet turn, and he was gone. Frank didn't flinch. He didn't blink. But Annabelle Mayfield, watching from a few rows back, thought she saw something shift in his shoulders. Something small, as if a burden had eased. Not taken away, but shared. The 6 men didn't linger. They turned quietly, walking out the same side door Frank had entered through hours earlier. No fanfare, no goodbye. And somehow that made it even more powerful. Annabelle didn't follow. She just watched. Then looked around. At the aisle he'd once been denied. At the chair that had once been off limits. At the silence that had once pushed him out. Now making room for him to stay. Voice softens final words slow and weighted. He didn't come to take a seat. He came to keep a promise. And when he stood quietly, the world finally stood with him. Have you ever watched someone be overlooked and wished you had spoken up?